part of your learning through learning about Australia. Please interrupt me at any stage if I speak too quickly, particularly with my accent. Also, I'll be showing a clip later on, and there's some farmers talking, so their accents get quite strong, so just tell me to pause it at any stage. So, just a little bit more about me. I finished my undergraduate from Melbourne Uni in a combined Bachelor of Commerce, Bachelor of Arts, Political Science. So I understand there's a few from the Political Science School here, the Arts Department. And then I spent 3 years with PricewaterhouseCoopers in a consulting role in the Economics and Policy team. So I worked with economists on developing and responding to policy for the state government. And from there I realised, one, I wanted to understand more about economics as a tool for making policy, as well as I really wanted to get back to my roots. My family have been farming for a number of generations, and I wanted to try and pull those two together. So that's how I ended up at UBC and the MFRE program. So interrupt me throughout with questions, and willing to talk to you later at the end about anything about consulting or the lecture, or also about the MFRE program here. So just a quick overview. Has anyone been to Australia here? Oh, wow, heaps more than I thought. Is anyone from Australia? Whereabouts? Oh, perfect. So for those that haven't been, I'll give a quick overview of us, our agricultural production, our GDP, our population, land use and things like that. I'll then look at our key commodities and markets, and then I'll split up the presentation by looking at my family's farm and how we've changed up our production in response to market changes as well as climate changes. I'll then, which leads on well to the first case study, I'm looking at land, which is a key passion of mine, and also not something that's widely consumed in Canada, so it's just an interesting piece. I'll then look to responding. There's a lot of loud talk around the world, and particularly in Australia, about the opportunities in Asia as a result of the growing middle class in demand for food. So I'll do a SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, of responding to that opportunity, and I just will give an overview of how Australia is placed relative to other competitors in that market. Which then leads on to the second and final case study. I'm looking at drought. It's quite hard to imagine that there's been farmers in Australia that haven't had rain for 2 or 3 years when we're surrounded by so many rainy days in Vancouver, but it's a real problem for us down there. And then some questions. So firstly, sorry, I'm using 2 systems, which so farming has been a major contributor to the Australian economy since we were first settled by the Europeans. In the first half of the 20th century, it actually accounted for about a quarter of our national GDP. Australia was said to be sort of founded on the sheep's back, and as wool production was key in that growing our economy from the very, very early days. So agriculture is really steeped in our history, and it's a really important industry for us. Just to note as well, any photos you see on the slides, they're all Creative Commons, and there'll be a blue link if they are. If they're not, if there's no link there, they're all photos taken by either my father or myself on the farm. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight as well. So quickly about Australia. So we're located in the Pacific between, well, our closest neighbours are Indonesia and Papua New Guinea to the north, and also New Zealand. Our population is currently just over, a little over 22 million. 1 in 4 Australians is actually born overseas. The majority still come from the UK, but New Zealand, China, India, Vietnam and Philippines follow quite closely. Now, we've often been referred to as the lucky country. It's been used to describe our weather, our climate, our lifestyle, and the diversity of our landscapes. And that term was sort of reborn during the global financial crisis because we were the only country of the G20 to never actually go into recession. In terms of contribution of ag and fisheries and forestry to GDP, it's about 3%, which might seem a little low, but when you start to take in all the factors along the supply chain and other services, it's actually around 12% of GDP. And another comparison, the US farm gate contribution to GDP in the US is about 0.8%, so that's just relative. So some comparative size. You can see in land base we're pretty big. But what's interesting, we actually have about 12% less arable land than the US. But interestingly, we've also got 280 million less people. So a little bit less arable land, but a hell of a lot less people. So we usually sit around 9 or 10 on the list of agricultural producers in terms of volume per year. But we're often seen as the most food secure of those nations because of our net position. We export about 60% of our products worldwide. So just quickly about land use, because we're relatively large in regards to latitude as well. We're about 4,000 kilometres from top to bottom. We're home to actually 8 of the world's 14 ecosystems. So we've got desert in the middle, we've got subtropical regions, Mediterranean forests, woodlands, scrubs, temperate ecosystems, as well as really rich marine environments. Over 60% of our land is actually used for agricultural activity. However, as we're the world's driest inhabited continent, our farmers have really been forced to become sort of productivity powerhouses. Just on land use, I'm not sure how well you can see this key, but I'll just draw your attention to a few things. So, firstly, the purple areas are either areas of nature conservation or protected areas or minimal use areas. So the largest section, which is the pinky, whitey, the light colour, is grazing of native vegetation. So it's more sturdy livestock, Brahman cattle are on these sort of areas. The yellow, the brighter yellow and the orange colours are dry land cropping and agriculture. So this is the opposite to irrigated agriculture, it's rain-fed agriculture, which is the largest base really. So on these areas we integrate cropping as well as livestock. And it's really, really vital to manage water in these areas, which I'll touch on during the presentation. So a little bit harder to see, nearly impossible to see, is the brown areas. So I've just got another map which actually pulls out what would have been brown, the red parts. So these are actually the percentage of irrigated pastures and cropping in Australia. So you can see it's quite a small percentage, and it's mainly centred around the Murray-Darling Basin, down in Victoria and New South Wales. The interesting thing is, in Australia, about 65 to 70% of the water we use as a nation goes into agriculture, and 90% of that amount is actually used solely in these regions. It's much more highly productive, and I just want to note that water isn't guaranteed to these producers every year. It goes up and down in response to rainfall and drought conditions. But what's interesting is, after our last big drought, which I'll talk about later, cotton production declined massively because that uses a lot of water, as well as rice production, which was a reasonably viable industry, has completely really ceased in Australia due to water. So next up, I know Mark's the market man, so I want to just introduce some of the key commodities we grow and also export out. So you can see here that 47 billion is the value of agricultural commodities produced, the gross value for 2012. Over 50% of this came from cropping alone. So in terms of, I've got that 15 commodities up there. These are in terms of production value, gross value. I've got a few bolded. They're ones I'll probably touch on a little bit more. So cattle and calves and wheat constitute the largest amount of our key commodities, and you can see there's a fairly big gap then until the next group. What's interesting, number 4 doesn't, it's fruit, it excludes grapes, but grapes actually come in their own right at number 13. And I'll also talk...
Does grape include wine production?
Pardon? Yes, for wine. And I'll draw on wine and the opportunities for Asia later on, so that's why I've bolded it there. In regards to our export markets, so as I said before, we export over 60% of what we grow and produce. Our biggest export market is China, followed by Japan, the EU and Indonesia. So our main export is wheat and beef, both processed, frozen, chilled, as well as some live exports, mainly to Indonesia and the Middle East, and that's a really political and contentious topic. I won't get into that today. Many reports that we've got limited opportunity for growth in the domestic market, so these markets are really important for the future viability of agriculture in Australia. What's interesting is that Australia exports so much of our product, but we often do it at what people say is a disadvantage because we've got such low levels of support. I understand from Mark you've learned about some input subsidies and supply management and a few things across the world. So every year the OECD develops these set of indicators, including the producer support estimates. So they try and measure and evaluate the level of government support that goes directly to farmers, mainly in the form of input subsidies. So up on the screen now are the most recent. It's not all of them, but it's just to give you a sample of the disparity. So Australia is second in OECD countries in terms of support from the government. As you can see, New Zealand's quite small, and then US and Canada sit somewhere in the middle, and then nearly up to 60% of farm production is provided by through money and through government support in places like Japan and Switzerland. So Australia is one of the most efficient producers of agriculture, in my opinion. And people have actually said the reason for this is because there aren't support systems like we see in other parts of the world. So just quickly, before I look at the actual opportunities for exporting in Asia, just tell you a little bit about my family farm. And the disclaimer is that I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we produce, and it might not be a representation of how other farmers grow and manage their farms, but particularly because of the wide variety of farming across the world, across Australia, But hopefully it provides something interesting about how we have changed what we do in response to particularly drought as well as demand. Also, when I refer to we in the next few slides, it's either my family or my father or my mother. I'll just use we. So our farm. So farming's been a really important part of my family for a long, long time. We born both my mother and my father's side. My father's side started farming in the 1900s in Victoria, which is sort of down southeast. And my paternal grandmother's side has actually been farming since the 1820s, which might not be too long for if there's any Europeans in the audience, but for Australia that's a pretty big chunk of our history. And the property which my mum and dad still currently farm on is a part of that original parcel of land. So it's really important to us. It's located, our farm, in the southern Riverina of New South Wales, which is midway between Sydney and Melbourne. It's the red area. And it's distinguished sort of by its flatness and its wet winters and dry summers. So although the southern Riverina is known as one of the most diverse agricultural and productive regions of Australia, it is like any farming and production enterprise. It's a 7-day-a-week job, and it's got some of the greatest challenges, physically and mentally. The pastures we have on our farm are mainly perennials, which means they're ongoing growth, greater than 1 year. And we use mainly phalaris and ryegrass. And these pastures, I think we just refer to them as grass, but we've got separate names for them. And these type of grasses are actually really good for running livestock on. So phalaris is actually the dominant temperate sown grass. It was introduced actually from the Mediterranean, but it does really well for livestock grazing as well as soil protection and its ability to combat weeds as well. So as you can see, there's really real and distinct seasons at home. The two pictures up there can just show you how different the farm can look year to year and season to season. Last summer we had about 2 weeks run of over 38 degrees and one day got up to about 46. So we're having longer summers and shorter springs, and spring's our peak growing season, so it's all getting really tough. But I'll get into drought, as I said at the end. It's hard to not talk about it a lot. So in regards, firstly, I said we do cattle, sheep and cropping. So